basically the sailors just decided after that event or after that incident to sort of have a sailors protest and call racing off for the day. A lot of these sailors, myself included, we have very little funding and we're basically just trying to make ends meet. And I think one of the big problems that we're seeing is that the sailors and coaches and federations are treating this as pretty much a professional sport, but race organization hasn't quite caught up to that yet. All right, guys, how is this for a new setup? This is my apartment here in Tarifa, but that's going to have to wait for another video because today I want to talk about something which has been pretty controversial lately in the laser ILCA sailing world, and that is the recent European Championships which happened in Andorra in Italy. And this isn't the only time that we've seen sailors at major Olympic class European Championships being up in arms at the race committee about what's going on with their regattas. Last year in October at the Formula Kite European Championships in Greece, there was also a big sort of uproar from the sailors after one of the days where there was a sailor who basically got flown across the boat park thanks to pretty bad launching conditions and generally racing and weather conditions. And basically the sailors just decided after that event or after that incident to sort of have a sailors protest and call racing off for the day. So I want to use this video and talk about some of my thoughts about why this is happening. Is it just a coincidence that these two European Championships have both had these major sort of, call them sailors protest events in like the last year? Or is it kind of a symptom of something bigger and a bigger problem that Olympic sailing in general is facing when it comes to regattas and funding? So sit back, grab a cup of coffee like I've got, and let's dive into it. So at the ILCA 6 and ILCA 7 Senior European Championships, which happened about a week ago in Andorra, Italy. When you're watching this, it's probably like 2 or 3 weeks ago now. Basically, I had heard all this stuff about, long days on the water, 6 hours on the water for only one race, or race committee setting the course in an area of no wind when, a couple of miles away there was perfectly good wind for racing, but it was just too deep to lay the marks. And then I saw this post on Instagram where the sailors were conducting a strike of sorts and basically decided not to go out racing for an hour, even though racing was scheduled. And then after the event, you saw all these sailors posting saying like, oh, I'm never coming back to the European Championships, or basically just bagging the race organizers and the race committee for how they conducted themselves. And so I wanted to talk about, or a bit about, what I think could be a good solution, because in some Facebook groups, there were people saying things like, oh, we should reduce the number of entries, that way it's not as difficult to get everyone racing, or we need to increase the entry fee so that we get better race management, or we need to make sure that we only have a list of sort of qualified race organizers who can run these sort of high level, what are now essentially professional level events. So yeah, I think some of those ideas are kind of good, but I think there's really just a much simpler solution, which is really going to help out all of the parties involved. But before I get started with what I think my solution, or what I think a good solution is for this problem of sailors not being happy with race quality at major events. I want to talk a bit about the state of Olympic sailing as it is. So the thing is, guys, that if you are trying to qualify for the Olympics in sailing in 2023, you are, for all intents and purposes, a professional sailor. But the thing is, a lot of these sailors, myself included, we have very little funding and we're basically just trying to make ends meet. And so when you're going to these major events like a European Championships, where basically your next year of funding could be entirely on the line with this one event, it's pretty crucial that you want to have good, fair racing and be able to give your best performance to try and get better funding for the next year. Because if you're campaigning in the laser, for example, in the ILCA 6 or ILCA 7, if you're doing it properly, you're probably spending at least $50,000 to $100,000, euros, dollars, whatever, a year. And if your entire funding for the next year rides just on this one event and you're out there waiting for 6 hours a day to get a race in crappy conditions, which then gets abandoned after it's been run by the race committee, you're going to be pretty pissed off. So that's where the sailors are coming from. And I think one of the big problems that we're seeing is that the sailors and coaches and federations are treating this as pretty much a professional sport, but race organization hasn't quite caught up to that yet. And so the thing to note about that is that both of these events occurred at venues which had not been previously tested before as Olympic class or Olympic level sailing venues. So in the case of the ILCA 6 and ILCA 7 Europeans, they were held in Andorra in Italy, which is not really known as a Olympic sailing venue or doesn't really have a history as a venue for Olympic classes like somewhere like Palma or Jerez does. And likewise for the Formula Kite Europeans last year, they were held in a place in Greece called Nafpaktos. And very noteworthy for me was that at the opening ceremony, they basically said how this is the biggest sporting event ever to come to that part of Greece. It's kind of difficult, right? Why are you holding such a major event at a venue which has never been tested before? You know, these are basically trial runs for the Olympics. Let's just call it that. You know, everyone who's going to these events wants to qualify for the Olympics. And so they're sort of expecting Olympic level race management. And nowadays we don't go to the Olympics never having tested out that venue before. You know, you'll see in the case for Tokyo in the last Olympics and now Marseille for the upcoming one, teams are there basically year round, testing the venue, getting used to it. And they're also running tons of practice regattas. You know, there's going to be the Olympic test event, then there's all these other test events, just to make sure that the race management know what they're doing, the volunteers know what they're doing, and basically everything runs smoothly. But with these class championships, like a world and a European championships, it seems that the race organizers, who are in general the class associations, they have this need to take these events to new venues every year. And I understand where they're coming from. I've been on that side of the equation as well, as in the race organization part of the equation. And I'm going to address that later in the video about why that's the case and why you might want to take these events to new venues. But I think in this day and age, with the level of professionalism in Olympic sailing, you really can't afford to be testing out new venues with a high level event like a European or World Championship. So I think that philosophy of taking these events to new venues every year is fine when you're doing like 1 or 2 events a year. And maybe back in the day when Olympic sailing wasn't as professionalized, it also would have worked well. But nowadays, it really just doesn't cut it, because all of these sailors, right, as I mentioned, they're spending $50,000 to $100,000 a year on their campaign, but they're basically doing it on a very amateur budget. You know, you might get $30,000 from your federation. So if you're trying to go to a new venue every year, you basically just eventually run out of good venues to use, right? There's only so many places around the world or around Europe which are capable of holding such a high level event with the adequate management. And so the first point I want to make, and kind of the theme of the whole video, is that I think going forward, race or regatta organizers really should consider using just one venue or one pre-existing event and lock that in for a number of years at a time as the main venue for the European Championships, or okay, this is where the World Championships is going to be for the next 2, 3, 4 years in a row. And I know that might sound like a pretty crazy idea for sailors or just anyone in our sport who's so used to having, oh, this year the World Championships are in Australia, and then the next year they're in France, and then the next year they're in Italy, because it completely changes sort of the philosophy of the World and European Championships in most classes to date. But in my eyes, that's really just the best solution. Let's just compare Olympic sailing to some other sports when it comes to venue selection. So let's take tennis, for example. Kind of not the same, because tennis obviously doesn't really rely on the weather like sailing does. Tennis has a lot more money behind it, but in tennis, there's a tour, there's lots of small events throughout the year, but at the end of the day, there's still the 4 major Grand Slams, which are held at the exact same place, pretty much the exact same time every year. And no one complains about getting bored of going to Wimbledon because it's Wimbledon. And so I don't think having the same event at the same venue every year is actually that big of a deal. And we can take another example as well, one which is much closer to our sport of sailing, and that would be surfing. So with professional surfing, it's much closer to sailing in that they obviously rely very heavily on the weather for their sport, just like we do. And with professional surfing, basically the tour or like the events pretty much stay the same year to year. Like there's maybe 1 or 2 events which change. Sometimes they sort of bring in like mystery events or like special edition events, but basically the stops are more or less the same. And that's just because they know, okay, in Hawaii at this time of year, there's usually good waves, and this beach has the infrastructure and the facilities needed to run a professional surfing event. And you don't see people complaining about, oh, we only go to this place at this time of year and the waves are always the same. It's just that's where the conditions are appropriate for the level of event that you're trying to run. And we're trying to run professional events. We don't want to be going to places where we don't know if there's going to be wind at that time of year, or we don't know if the race committee are going to be able to set a course. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And then if we bring that back to sailing, we have events which we go to every year basically at the same places which have been run for years. And we don't consider using those venues for anything. I'm thinking of regattas like Palma, like Hier's, like Kiel Week. You could sort of say the Allianz, Holland, Medemblik Regatta, whatever it's going as nowadays. But the point is that these events, basically all of the same sailors are going to these events every year. We know there's usually going to be decent conditions. And more importantly, we also know that these venues have the ability to run high-level Olympic sailing regattas. And so what I think we should be doing as a sport is looking to host our major championships either at the same time as these events. So for example, like a week's time, basically everyone who was at the European Championships in Italy will be going to Parma to do the Princess Sofia Trophy. If we could, as a sport, go to the organisers of the Princess Sofia Trophy and say, we'd like to run our European Championships in conjunction with your Princess Sofia Trophy, we know that the race management's going to be good, we know the weather's usually going to be pretty good, and all of the same sailors are going there anyway. So there's also another couple of reasons why I think this is the most practical solution to getting the best racing for sailors at the lowest cost. The first, well, I guess this is kind of like a supporting reason, but the thing is with these events, they often rely on funding from a national federation or from a local government or from sponsors, for example. And you use that funding to try and run a better event and keep costs down for the sailors. But the thing is, if you're going to, at least in my opinion, a government trying to get funding for an event, and you can say to them, guys, we've got the European Championships that we want to host at this place, let's call it Parma for example's sake. We want to host the ILCA European Championships in Parma at this time of year for the next 4 years in a row. That's a much more attractive prospect to a government to give better funding for than if we just say, okay, we're going to have the European Championships in Parma for this 1 year. Then the local government knows that for 4 years in a row, basically the same number of sailors, let's call it 300 between the ILCA 6 and ILCA 7 fleets, plus coaches and support staff, etc., they're all going to be coming to our town at the same time every year. And that's going to be bringing a huge tourism and economic boost to the town, and it's locked in for 4 years. That's way more attractive than saying, okay, we're going to have this once-off event in Parma, for the example in this case, and it's going to bring these 300 sailors, coaches, support staff, but there might not be that much of a lasting benefit afterwards. And the same goes for sponsors. Like if sponsors are looking at supporting an event, they don't get that much recognition out of just supporting a once-off event in a town or a city. They're going to get much better value for their money if they can get behind an event which is going to be consistent and happening multiple times in the same venue and can actually generate some hype in that place. And one of the things with getting more funding for these events is that you can then charge less to the sailors. One of the biggest complaints from the sailors at the European Championships was that ILCA then asked them, so the European laser class, then asked them in a survey afterwards if they would pay more to get better race management. And that really pissed off a lot of sailors. So if you can get better funding and better sponsorship for an event, then you're going to be able to lower the entry cost for sailors, which is going to make everyone happy. That sort of ties into my final point for why I think this would work, is that having the events at the same venue or consistent venues planned well in advance is just going to make planning and logistics easier for sailors and also bring costs down in general. As it is with most Olympic campaigns, if you're basically, no matter where you're from, you're probably going to have at least 2 boats. If you're from somewhere like Australia or the US, for example, you're probably even going to have 3 boats. And that's because of how the regattas work. So, for example, in my case, from Australia, when I was in the laser, you would need at least 1 boat in Europe because you're going to do events like Palma, Hier's, Kiel. You're going to need 1 boat at home in Australia for training and racing. And then in times or quads where the Olympics is in Japan, for example, you're going to need a 3rd boat in Japan. And so if we know that every year the World Championships is going to be in, let's call it Kiel, then you don't need to have that 3rd boat, because the boat you use in Europe is the same boat you can use for the World Championships every year. And you don't need to be shipping an additional boat to wherever the World Championships is going to be. So that's going to bring costs down massively for sailors, which is another great thing, and something that all of the sailors can get behind. And the thing is, like in the example I gave with Palma, if we said we're going to have our European Championships there, like all the sailors are going to that venue anyway. They're all going to be doing the Princess Sophia Trophy in a week's time. By the time you're seeing this, it's probably just started, I think. But if they're all going to that venue anyway, it basically cuts out another trip for sailors, or another trip to a new venue, which just makes it easier again, because you don't need to pay for extra accommodation, you don't need to book, you don't need to drive, etc., etc. You get the point. And so knowing all of that, knowing that, okay, for this entire Olympic quad, the European Championships are going to be in Palma, for example, at this time of year. You can basically plan your entire quad around that, which is great for sailors, because as it is at the moment, maybe you know at best 2 years in advance where a regatta is going to be. And so trying to plan out your quad and your funding and how you're going to spend your money, it just becomes insanely difficult if you don't know, oh, where am I going to next year for the Europeans? Having this all scheduled out, locked in for an entire quad, or 2 to 3 years at a time, is going to make planning and logistics way easier, because you don't need that second or even third boat. You don't need to plan trips to a new venue. And you obviously don't need to do all the other traveling and booking and logistics associated with going to these additional venues. And the other thing is, guys, it's just risky really for us as sailors to be putting a huge amount of money into these events. For example, if I were doing the European Championships in Italy that had just gone by, I would have spent, let's say, I think 350 euros on my entry fee, probably 1,000 euros on accommodation, probably if I was chartering another 1,000 euros. So you're looking at nearly 3,000 euros just for this one event, which is going to be held at a venue that you have no experience with, and you don't know if it's going to be a good event or not. And that's a pretty big risk for the sailors to be taking every year. So I've talked about now why I think we should look at locking in our events to certain venues throughout the Olympic quad, instead of what we currently do, where we try and find new venues for our Worlds and European Championships every year. So I've talked about why I think that's probably the best or most fair way forward. Now I want to talk about the perspective from the regatta organizers and why you wouldn't do it that way, or why we haven't done it that way so far. And so really the reason for spreading out these events is that you can say it's more fair for sailors, and also for the different countries that make up, these sort of like class associations, like the laser class associations. You can also say that having events in various countries also helps promote the class in that area. And the other argument would also be that it's just keeping it more interesting for sailors. And so I want to talk about those points and why I think they're not really that relevant anymore. So in terms of promoting the sport, the thing is with these events, right? Firstly, they are Olympic level events. So they're basically the very pinnacle of our sport in all the Olympic classes. So in reality, the sport's moved on. There's, as I said before, all of these sailors are basically full-time athletes. And in my opinion, I don't think we should necessarily be opening these events up to, everyday sort of recreational sailors, because we expect like a high quality event. And having and opening these events up to sailors who aren't at Olympic caliber is going to make race management more difficult, and it's just going to lower the quality of racing in general. And it's also not like having, say, an ILCA 6, ILCA 7 senior European championships at some venue is going to encourage all these other people to get into that class. It's not like kids are jumping from the Optimist to the Laser because the ILCA 6, ILCA 7 senior European championships is coming to their club. Maybe they're getting a bit inspired when they see, these famous Olympic sailors there, but it's not like they go into the ILCA or Laser with aspirations of actually participating in that event. And with these events, as I mentioned, it's a once-off at this one venue, which, if we're honest with ourselves, most of these events are poorly publicized and really don't get that much media attention from sailing or mainstream media. So it's not like they're actually doing that good of a job of promoting the sport or promoting the class in that area or just in general. And the way this is a topic for another video that I'm probably going to make, but with how our sailing events are run, most of the times they're basically just closed off to the public in a kind of exclusive private yacht club where members of the public who wouldn't normally be interested in sailing can't really get access to these events anyway. So it's not like they're actually doing that good of a job of promoting the sport to the non-sailing audience. And then one of the other points from a race management side or race organizer side about why we would be taking these events to different venues is that it offers an opportunity for these venues to upgrade their resources, get better funding. But as I mentioned, if it's just a once-off event, you're not really going to get that much funding or support in general, or not as much as you could, in my opinion. And in reality, for a lot of these events, the jury get flown in, the race officer gets flown in, and then afterwards they leave. So sure, they might leave a bit of an impact behind at these clubs, but it's not really going to be that big. But if you lock in an event for a number of years and you can then use the funding to upgrade ribs or upgrade start boats, upgrade marks for the venue, then that's going to have a much longer lasting impact on that venue and that club than just having a once-off event at an untested venue. I'm not necessarily saying that we need to go to these well-known big venues for our events. It's more that we shouldn't be testing new venues with these big events. Like Andorra might be a great venue for racing, but just going there once for one regatta doesn't really give us the opportunity to actually maximize its potential. And so if we said that Andorra is going to be the venue for the European Championships for the entire 2024 quad and lock that in, then over time, each year it's going to become better and better, going to get better funding, and then you can actually leave a sort of more lasting impact on that venue when the European Championships moves elsewhere. Because at the moment, I don't think having a once-off event at a certain club is actually adding that much in terms of long-term benefits. And so then the next point I kind of want to address is about the keeping it interesting and also being more fair to other countries. And the thing is, sure, it's more fair to spread events around. But as I mentioned, most of us as Olympic campaigners, we're on a pretty tight budget, and having to go to new places or different places for the Worlds and the European Championships each year is just adding another massive cost to our entire campaign. And the thing is, like, all of these, the exact same sailors are all going to Palma next week anyway, or they're all going to Hier's. Like, it's kind of, it just doesn't make sense to be having another venue that the exact same sailors are going to be racing each other in, but just adding additional cost. Like, you can just go to Palma next week and run the exact same event and all the same people are going to be there. Why are we having an additional event with the same people at some other different location when everyone's already planning on going to Palma at that time of year? I think it's just, yeah, better all round for sailors. And that's the thing with like the boring, keeping it interesting argument. As it is, we go to Palma every year. We go to Hier's every year and people don't complain about it. It's just like, it's just part of the circuit. It's not boring. You know, you get different conditions at these venues all the time. And at the end of the day, what the sailors care about is the racing, and they want good, fair racing. And so it's not seen as boring to be going to these same venues every year. And so to sum it all up, Olympic sailing, it's really facing a lot of challenges, and trying to run high quality events at low costs for sailors is probably one of the biggest. And in my opinion, we can solve that problem pretty easily by just selecting one venue for each championship for a number of years in a row. That's going to bring better funding to both the event and lower costs for sailors. It's going to allow the sailors to plan better and structure their campaigns more easily. And it's also going to provide better racing conditions for sailors and higher quality race management. So it's basically a win all round for race management, the club, and for the sailors. And just doing it, it's going to make running a high quality event much more likely. And that just makes it much easier for a lot of the Olympic campaigners who, you know, we're struggling as it is financially, and for the amount of time that we have. So those are my thoughts on what we should be doing with our high level events in Olympic sailing going forward. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, let me know in the comment box. If you think I'm completely crazy and this idea is just doesn't work with sailing, you can always let me know by hitting the subscribe button.